Hi there, welcome to this week's Accessibility Bite. Today we're talking about accessible color contrast, a key factor in designing inclusive digital content. Whether you're working on websites, documents, or presentations, ensuring sufficient color contrast is crucial for readability and usability. By the end of this session, you'll know what accessible color contrast is and why it matters, how color contrast affects users, including those with visual disabilities, as well as best practices and tools for checking contrast compliance. Let's dive in. Color contrast refers to the difference in brightness between text and its background. Sufficient contrast ensures that text is readable for all users, including those with visual impairments. According to the Web Content Accessibility Guidelines, or WCAG, the minimum contrast ratio for text is 4 to 5 to 1 for normal text and 3 to 1 for large text, which is defined as text size 18 or 14 bolded. This visual shows texts that meet the minimum requirements for color contrast. For many, even these color combinations are difficult to read. Imagine trying to read light gray text on a white screen. Frustrating, right? Now imagine you have a visual impairment or are in bright sunlight. Poor contrast makes that content difficult or even impossible to read. Ensuring sufficient color contrast isn't just about following guidelines. It's about making content readable for everyone. For users with low vision or color blindness, for example, high contrast can mean the difference between accessible and unreadable text. It also benefits all users by improving visibility in different lighting conditions, whether you're in bright sunlight or a dim room. Plus, meeting WCAG standards isn't just best practice, it's a step toward true digital inclusivity, ensuring that everyone can access and engage with your content. Here are 4 quick tips for maintaining accessible color contrast. Number 1, use high contrast color combinations. Light text on a dark background, or vice versa, generally works best. Number 2, don't rely on color alone. Color shouldn't be the only way to convey information. Add text labels, underlines, or patterns in addition to color to ensure clarity and meaning. Number 3, avoid using overly bright colors. Bright neon colors can cause strain and reduce readability. And number 4, test your color contrast. You can use easily available and free web tools to double-check that your color contrast meets standards. We've covered what accessible color contrast is and why it's crucial for creating inclusive content. Now, let's see it in action. In the following demonstrations, we'll walk through how to use a color contrast checker tool, examples of good and poor contrast choices, and how to update your colors to be more accessible in documents, web design, or presentations. Let's practice.
Starting in Microsoft Word, to check for color contrast issues, you can go to the Review tab in the toolbar and then selecting Check Accessibility. The Accessibility Assistant on the right-hand side will point out any hard-to-read contrast issues. In this document, it's pointing out one issue. If I click on that error, it highlights the text that needs to be changed. In this example, I have a large heading at 20-point font with a subheading at 12-point font, both using the same shade of gray. However, the contrast checker is only highlighting the subheading as having an issue. That's because according to WCAG AA standards, the contrast ratio between this gray and the white background is acceptable for large fonts, but not for small fonts. I can use the Accessibility Assistant to update this font to be a more accessible contrast ratio. It even offers me some color options to choose from, and now it tells me, looks good, no issues found. In Microsoft PowerPoint, we recommend using the provided templates for better accessibility. These templates come with properly formatted titles, subtitles, and other text boxes, so you don't need to worry about properly styled text. To choose a template, you can go to the Design tab in the toolbar, and then select Designer. This opens the Designer side panel that shows you a few selections, and you can click the See More Design Ideas to browse even more. If you find a template you like, but you don't like the color scheme, under Themes in the toolbar, you can browse a selection of different color options. This uses the same template, but changes up the color scheme and fonts. There's even variants next to that once you select a theme. Playing around with these different options, you can create some pretty customized looks while making accessibility a lot easier to manage for yourself. If you decide to manually change colors in your PowerPoint presentation, you'll need to do a more thorough accessibility check. PowerPoint does have the same built-in accessibility checker that we see in Word. You can access this by going to Review in the toolbar and then selecting Check Accessibility. One issue with the online version of PowerPoint is that the accessibility checker does not check the contrast between your font color and the background of a slide. The background of a slide is different than if we were to use a highlight color or a shape fill. Because we can't rely on the built-in accessibility checker, we'll need to do this manually. One way to get an idea of where there might be some contrast issues is in the Accessibility tab of the toolbar. There's an option for Inspect Without Color. This makes your presentation grayscale and can make it a little bit easier to identify contrast issues. There are a lot of free online color contrast checkers. One of them is the WebAIM contrast checker. An easy way to check as you go is to have your screen split so that you can see the contrast checker on one side and whatever you're working on the other side. WebAIM's contrast checker allows you to use a color picker so that you can get the exact shade that you're using. Click on Color Picker, and this opens up a small dialog box with an eyedropper tool that you can then select. This then allows you to move your mouse over your content and select the colors that you're using. The foreground is going to be your font color, while the background is the color behind your font. WebAIM tells me what the contrast ratio is, and also tells me, based on which standards, whether this contrast fails or passes. It's important to note that it also points out the difference between normal text and large text. This tool also comes with helpful sliders underneath the color pickers that I can use to increase the ratio until I get a passing contrast. I can then highlight the hex value to copy, and then back in PowerPoint, I'll highlight the problem font, select the down arrow next to the font color, then More Colors, and in the hex field, I'll paste the same code that I got from WebAIM. Now I can be sure that the color contrast ratio between this font and the background is more accessible. If you're using something like Canva to create content, you can check contrast ratio issues using their accessibility checker. To access the Canva accessibility checker, click on File in the upper left, Accessibility, and then check Design Accessibility. This opens a panel on the right-hand side that lets us know what issues are occurring. In this example, it's telling me that this document has 2 issues. I can click on Color Contrast in the Accessibility checker, and it will then show me which issues are in my document. I'll select the first issue, which is this Back to School font that's a light yellow on a dark yellow background, and Canva will provide me with suggested text color. Canva's accessibility checker also identifies issues if only part of your font has a contrast issue. In this example, I have some red font, and I'm going to move this text over a graphic that also has that same red color. While only part of my text is on that same red color, I can see in the accessibility checker that it's been flagged for having low contrast. For those working in Canvas, we can use the accessibility checker right below our editor to check for contrast issues. It's especially important in Canvas to be mindful of this, because a lot of the provided default colors in the palette picker are actually not accessible against a white background. In this example page, I have 2 headings with an orange font color. I can see the Ally Accessibility Checker has flagged 2 issues. When I click on this, the Accessibility Checker opens on the side panel with a color picker that allows me to adjust the color until the Apply button becomes clickable. Once this is clickable, I know that my color contrast ratio is more accessible. Something else to be mindful of when using font colors is not to rely solely on font color to convey meaning. For example, having instructions that say something like steps in green are required. We can use color to emphasize, but we also want to make sure that we're using text-based instruction. I mentioned earlier that there's a lot of free color contrast checkers that you can use on the web. If you're working on something that has a lot of different colors on it, you can also search for accessible color palette builders. This free online tool allows me to select my colors at the top and displays a table below showing all of the color combinations and which ones are accessible to use for a font color with a background color. When you find a tool that you like, we recommend bookmarking it so that you can easily find it in the future. By using built-in accessibility checkers and online tools like contrast checkers and palette builders, while also not relying solely on color to convey meaning, you ensure that your design is more inclusive of folks who are visually diverse, such as those who are blind, colorblind, prone to eye strain, and migraines.
I hope you found that demonstration helpful. As we wrap up, remember, color contrast ensures readability and accessibility for everyone. Follow WCAG guidelines for text and non-text elements. use contrast checker tools to confirm compliance. Thank you for joining us for this Accessibility Byte today. Remember, small changes lead to big impacts. See you next time.